Welcome to this Asia Global Podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. Subscribe to Asia Global Online, our weekly digital journal, by going to the Asia Global Online or the Asia Global Institute website. And follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. Now, in this Asia Global Podcast episode, we are focusing on China's technology sector, specifically on the development of what people call the platform economy. These tech giants, familiar names to China watchers and others, Alibaba and Didi Chuxing, Meituan, Tencent, and others. Now, we're joined for this episode by Andrew Collier. Andrew is Managing Director and founder of Orient Capital Research here in Hong Kong. Orient Capital Research conducts independent research on China. It analyzes China's macroeconomy, particularly shadow banking. And I should note here that Andy literally wrote the book on shadow banking and the rise of capitalism in China. OCR also looks at the intersection of policy and economic trends in the mainland China. OCR also conducts due diligence on industries and stocks for funds seeking a deeper analysis of specific issues. So Andy is the former president of the Bank of China International USA, where he helped to launch BOCI's US office. Earlier in his career, he was an equity analyst with Bear Stearns and CLSA in Hong Kong and a journalist covering business for the South China Morning Post in Beijing. He has a master's degree in international relations and Chinese studies from Yale University and studied Chinese at Beida at Peking University. He also is a senior fellow at the Mansfield Foundation in Washington. And Andy here is currently based in Hong Kong, and he's joining us from just down the road. So Andy, welcome to Asia Global Podcast.
Thank you very much, Al. Thanks for having me.
Great. Now, Andy's here because he wrote a third book, and it's called China's Technology War, Why Beijing Took Down Its Tech Giants, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Did I get that right, Andy? I know you just told me it's the third book.
That's right. Yeah, it's a third book. That's correct.
But my short-term memory is pretty taxed these days. So this is a fantastic book. Frankly, I only just finished it before joining Andy here. And so we'll get into that. But, let's talk a bit, Andy, about a very current topic that's related to a lot of the issues and themes in your book, which is that China and the US have just signed at the end of last week an audit oversight agreement after long negotiations. So the US Public Company Accounting Oversight Board signed a statement of protocol with the China Securities Regulatory Commission and the Ministry of Finance of the People's Republic of China. And this is a first step towards opening access for the PCAOB to inspect and investigate registered public accounting firms headquartered in mainland China and Hong Kong, completely and consistent with US law. So Andy, this has been making news. It's given a boost to the markets. Why is this agreement for audit oversight, why is it important?
Well, the U.S. Congress recently had put in place some laws that essentially was going to kick off something like 200 Chinese companies from the U.S. exchanges in 2024, unless they came to an agreement on accounting standards. And the concern is that Chinese accounting standards are often a lot more lax than the United States accounting standards. And obviously in a climate of hostility between the two countries, that's not a good thing. So the fact that they came to a sort of preliminary agreement is a very positive sign going forward. And I know that the U.S. is treating it seriously because I found out this week that they've already arranged housing and a long-term stay for something like a dozen or 2 dozen accountants from the United States who will be coming here for a period of several months, starting in September. However, I do remain somewhat skeptical because there's a couple of issues there. First of all, there's huge concerns about data security. So if the accounting board talks to the accounting firms in China and says basically, look, we need some more information about the companies that you're auditing, and the accounting firms go back to China, they may get a no from a whole bunch of agencies that are involved in security in China. And remember, this is an agreement between the United States and the China Securities Regulatory Commission. Now, the CSRC's main job is to try to raise capital and free up the capital markets. However, the main job of many other agencies, such as the Ministry of State Security and the Cybersecurity Commission, is to make sure that that their standards of data security are not broached. So I am kind of skeptical that this is going to be effective, except for sort of a limited number of companies that are relatively clean in terms of their government relationships, and also have already had probably pretty good accounting anyway. But still, it's a positive step, and it shows that China is willing at least to show that it's going to play ball with the West.
Right. So does this essentially avert the delisting that was in prospect, as well as the shift of a lot of these companies were supposed to come here to Hong Kong? They're not welcome in the United States. Does this kind of postpone that, or?
Yes, it could very well postpone that for those companies that are willing to provide the data and are allowed to provide the relevant data to satisfy the PCAOB. So I think that some of those companies, many of those companies will end up listing in Hong Kong because it's a more easier environment, and there are fewer rules, and also there's less uncertainty. I mean, U.S.-China relations is doing so badly now that the uncertainty about whether you're going to have problems, even if you get over this accounting issue, maybe something else will come up in a year or two. So a lot of companies may just throw up their hands and say, well, there's plenty of money in Hong Kong. There's plenty of global money in Hong Kong for that matter. So why don't we just relist here? The China does not want to cut off its ties to foreign capital, though. They like the idea of the discipline that the U.S. markets bring, the brand name, the expansion. I mean, if you list your company, then immediately you have a much better name to sell your goods. And there's it's several $1 trillion worth of capital that's been raised. So I think that there may be some halfway measure for a certain portion of companies that will work.
Right. And as you mentioned, these inspectors our auditors are ready to go, because in the statements issued and in the agreement itself, it's as early as September. So it's just a matter of days, really, when this process will start here in Hong Kong. At least. Yes.
So we should get some news. I mean, I don't know how much information they'll get, but they're coming in a week or two. And my concern is the two agreements differ in their wording between China and the U.S. U.S. agreement basically says they will have more or less free access to the auditors, and the Chinese agreement sort of indicates that it has to go through government agencies for approval. So even there, it's one of these classic Chinese agreements, which sort of they write it and pretend that both sides have agreed when they haven't really agreed. But as I said,
China's not the only one that does that. Let me just say
that's true. That's true. Yeah. That's true.
Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you, but I wanted to make that point.
No, I mean it's a step in the right direction, and I was pleased to see that. And it shows that at least part of the Chinese system is interested in continuing to engage with the West and the United States in particular.
Right. Now, in fact, what I've been thinking about the last few days is, okay, they come to Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has a different environment, different standards, and such, at least on these issues. Once they go into the mainland and try to do the same thing, then that's really where the proof of the pudding will have to be. You have to really see what happens. And the result.
That's precisely the problem, and there's layers of problems. Basically, the first one is that just getting the basic financial data is often not easy in China, particularly since a lot of companies do a lot of side deals when they raise capital, essentially shadow banking, that are off their balance sheets. The second issue is the data security issue, which is suddenly the government ministry says, well, look, we really can't talk about whether these revenues are accurate or not because there's too much data to be handed over to the United States. And the third issue is that there's a lot of other agencies that may not even be interested in talking, like provincial authorities. You go to a provincial authority and say, okay, prove to us that you've sold this amount of land. And they'll say, well, we really don't want to talk about that. So we'll see how much data is forthcoming.
Right. So tie this into the themes in your book, because what I find fascinating and brilliant about your book is that whilst you are focusing on the technology sector, the platform economy, you really tie in so many different strands of what's going on in China. You look at common prosperity, you look at the Communist Party and its use of ideology, or greater use of ideology these days, and the search for control. You look at the situation in Hong Kong, you look at Xi Jinping as his personality. I mean, you really cover quite a lot of issues within that context of the technology sector and the challenges it's facing now in terms of regulation and control. So how does this all fit in? So how should we see this this new sort of auditing agreement in that bigger picture that you write about so well in your book?
Well, Al, you've raised the right point. I mean, my favorite part of the book was trying to put this more broad context of the political and institutional and economic structure around the crackdown on these big tech companies. But that was also the hardest part, because then as you said, I ended up in a fairly short book talking about the Communist Party's origins and a whole bunch of other stuff. And hopefully I didn't go too broad from the main theme. But my main point is that there's too much focus in China watchers, particularly in the United States, on isolated aspects of the Chinese system. So if you talk about the delisting of a company, then you talk to a lot of people, you end up focusing on the exchanges in the United States, the exchanges in China. If you're a sort of a political analyst, then you'll talk about the Communist Party and control aspects. If you're a lawyer, you're talking about the regulation of the financial system. And what I was trying to say is that there are a lot of moving parts in China, as with a very big country, and therefore you should try to tie that together. And the basic thesis of the book is that this was not an isolated event. It had to do with broader themes about the way Xi Jinping is running China, and particularly the control that is being exercised by the Communist Party. The other thesis is the one that most people focus on, is what they call regulatory catch-up, which is basically look, you've got these big Alibaba, they're selling goods online. What's the difference between Amazon having too much market share? It's oligopolies or monopolies by these big companies, and therefore it's perfectly fair for the system in China to try to regulate them. And while I agree with that, I do think there's a lot more politics behind this. And therefore, you have to talk about how the Communist Party sees things and how it's influencing the financial system.
Well, Eddie, you've got to be right on that, because I don't think it could be just one or the other. I mean, all of these things, the regulatory aspect of it, which, China is dealing with a tech sector in the same way that so many countries, including the United States, are trying, in Europe, are trying to figure out, well, what do we do about these big giants and the data security issues, data governance issues. So China is really wrestling with those same questions, but how can you not include, as you do, that political dimension, not only the domestic side of it, but also the global geopolitical side of it.
Right. That's a hard part, because the analogy I used is if you look at a black hole in space, you can't really examine it, but you can only examine its impact around it. So the Communist Party, in a sense, doesn't publicize its actions, but you have to look at the impact that they have on the way the financial system is regulated. But it's similar to, I was just thinking just now of Lyndon Johnson, when he instituted the Great Society programs that revolutionized welfare in the United States. A lot of the reason he did that is in order to become president. He knew he had to court certain liberal voters. So similarly, I think Xi Jinping there's a lot of power aspects involving the Communist Party behind the crackdown on the tech companies that is purely basically concerned with the threat that these companies may pose to the future of the Communist Party. On the other hand, just as with Johnson's programs in the United States in the 60s, a lot of these programs may have some benefit in reducing the the control these companies have and monopolies they have.
Right, indeed. Of course, Xi Jinping and the quality of his power, the way he wields his power will be kind of front and center fairly soon, as we're going to see him gain a unprecedented third term, right, in power.
Yes, in fact, that's one of the things I talk about, because he along with the crackdown, which is essentially reducing the size and scope and revenue of some of these big companies from a kind of strictly financial perspective, Xi Jinping also instituted something called common prosperity, more or less at the same time. And common prosperity is, in his mind, was a way to try to reduce inequality in China. And he was saying things like all these listed firms that provide tutoring to students to get them into good schools in China and in the West are too expensive. People shouldn't be spending money on them. And, the reduction of Alibaba's size was a function of, maybe it's too much monopoly. But in my mind, it's also a populist slogan ahead of his potential third term, which we're going to find out about in October, and his popularity in general. So in his mind, he sees it as a campaign that is common prosperity we're talking about, that will make the Communist Party more appealing to people, while at the same point, it will also help to support the takedown of the tech companies. So those two, the soft power, I guess you call it, in some ways hard regulation, are moving hand in glove.
So this is the kind of what I really love about your book, because you do connect those dots, and it's great that you do, because I think it's important for folks that just look at this, not to look at certain things in isolation, but I understand that. But let's go back to maybe the first dot in your book, which is Jack Ma Yun's speech on October 24, 2020, and you go back to it quite a lot in your book. Well, just tell us, why was it so important? And it seemed to unleash that kind of firestorm, even though a lot of things were in train even before it, but it kind of opened kind of floodgates for regulation, or greater attention, if you will, by the regulatory authorities in China.
Well, that's a problem. Every time you write history, you try to find a turning point, and you can over exaggerate that turning point. So, I mean, that was one of the things I was concerned with. But there's no doubt that when Jack Ma stood up in that audience, he was addressing essentially a financial conference in Shanghai, and a lot of very senior leaders were there, and very senior regulators from the Central Bank of China and the CSRC, the regulator for the financial system, and some others. And obviously, Jack Ma, speaks English. He's friendly to the West. His company was one of the largest companies in the world. He's quite popular as an individual, because he's a guy who people like. I think, generally speaking, he's kind of user friendly, unlike maybe Bill Gates, or so the people at Google who aren't quite so user friendly. This is a guy everybody sort of admires and likes. Yes. And he gets up there and he essentially says things that the regulators in the room aren't controlling the financial system very well. And he also kind of indicated that they were kind of old and out of touch. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody told me I was old and out of touch and I was in charge of the Central Bank of China, I wouldn't take too kindly to that. And the other point that I try to make is that, not only is he saying these things that were critical, and not only is he popular, and not only is he one of the wealthiest people in China, but he also raised a lot of money in the Western markets, because, Alibaba is listed in the West. And the combination of all of that was clearly too much. And according to one report in the Wall Street Journal, which tends to be pretty clued in on some of these issues and is willing to publish it, Xi Jinping himself was not happy with that. And shortly thereafter, basically, that we saw a host of large companies, including Alibaba, have their wings clipped big time. Didi, the Uber of China, called Didi Chuxing, listed, and then within days, it had its revenue reduced quite drastically just after they listed. Ant Financial, which is an online bank owned by Alibaba, just before this huge IPO in Hong Kong that was getting a lot of attention and was going to have global, investors buying into, was canceled. So, and then a lot of other things happened within the coming year that I describe in the book, including common prosperity.
And Jack Ma himself kind of disappeared for a little bit, right?
Yes, that's right. He disappeared. He showed up months later, I think, at a charity function. But basically, he fell off the face of the map. And then you had, I talk about in the book about common prosperity. You suddenly had actresses getting accused of malfeasance and all sorts of stuff that it definitely was a shift in tone in the political system. And I think that speech was the catalyst for a lot of that.
So you even link in things like limits on video gaming, for example. You bring in you talk about some issues such as the leadership's questioning about the nature of masculinity in China, masculine imagery, things like that, which again, when you read some of the media coverage of this, I mean, they look at these things in isolation. But again, what I really like is that you connect those things to a lot of what we've been seeing relating to the tech platforms.
Well, I found that whole part fascinating, very difficult to write because it's basically non-financial. But so initially you start with what they call a regulatory crackdown or a regulatory catch-up, where they're trying to rein in these giants. But then all of a sudden you get into common prosperity, which is not directly related, but is obviously tied in. And then you get into this kind of culture war. I mean, it reminds me, almost like what you have in the United States about the way people should act and so forth, and how to function in society. Now, the video crackdown is a perfect example of that, where you had some companies that maybe had too much market share and maybe were charging too much. But then there was a talk about how people were playing too many video games. So is that a regulatory function? I mean, how do you restrict that? So, but then you go beyond that and you start saying, well, maybe people should be reading more books. And what I ultimately concluded is that Xi Jinping is a guy who came out of an era that shaped his personality, as it does with all of us. And similar to Ronald Reagan, who was very effective as a president in some ways, but he had a pretty outdated view of the way America was working. He's got kind of a 1950s view of, women staying at home, and a very traditional view of American life. And that shaped a lot of his policies. I think similarly with Xi Jinping, he was in the Cultural Revolution. At a brief point, he actually lived in a cave and his father was one of the founding members of the Communist Party, or the Long March. Xi Jinping is what they call a princeling in that sense. And he clearly is a bit of a believer in the future of the Communist Party, or very much a believer, and the importance of the Communist Party in keeping the Chinese country intact going forward. And he views the central place of the party as the only way that China can avoid a Soviet-style breakup, which is a huge fear within China. So the culture wars that started to come in after the Jack Ma speech and the crackdown on the tech sector, I think reflected his own mindset. So he made a lot of statements about, trying to make people adhere to Communist Party values, and and equality of income, and a lot of things that actually on the face of it look perfectly benign. But when you translated that into policy, it got to be pretty severely strict on the way people were behaving. Most countries don't restrict video gaming that much. I mean, maybe we should, but that tends not to happen. So that was an interesting shift.
So one thing, though, that you allude to, you talk about is, well, I mean, I appreciate the fact that you liken this kind of focus on culture issues, the culture wars, as it were, to what we see in the United States and indeed in some other countries. But one of the things that then that comes up is, well, when a leader sort of focuses on these cultural issues, these issues of culture and social behavior and mores and things like that, that it in some ways might be looked on as a way to obviate the problem they might be having with the economy and the outlook for the economy, the actual bread and butter products that they're supposed to be serving to the people, but then you kind of distract by focusing on ideological issues and cultural issues. So talk a bit about that, because that's, I think, a very important thing to look at. Not only because China is particularly right now with the effects of the pandemic, but China inevitably its growth is slowing, and that it's heading into a different kind of phase in its economic development.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I mean, I call it populism. I mean, in some ways it's similar, I think, to Donald Trump, who basically made a lot of statements about trying to help people, but his policies were, for the most part, fairly ineffective. I mean, the trade war and so forth didn't do much for the average person in the United States, and his other policies were pretty ineffective. But he made a lot of statements about helping people. Now, Xi Jinping is, I think, engaging in the same kind of populism. And as you pointed out, it's a time when China is going through a real difficult time because its debt bubble and demographic issues and some other problems are now coming to the fore. And so the economy's slowing, and there's not much that China can do about that because they've essentially backed themselves into a corner in the way they run their economy. So he's definitely trying to influence the direction of the Chinese state and also the economy. But I don't think it's so much that he's catering to people. I think he believes in many of the things he's saying. I give him credit for that, in fact. However, I think there's a limit to what unlike what we hear in Washington on a day-by-day basis, there's a limit to what the Communist Party and what the Chinese state can do in terms of changing the direction of the economy and helping people's incomes, unless they make fundamental changes by essentially moving away from a state-controlled system, which they don't want to do. So when I see Xi Jinping making these statements about common prosperity and populism and calls for charity from some of these large companies, I see weakness. I see a leader who can't make fundamental changes or is unwilling in some cases and is resorting to slogans, basically. And those slogans are not having a huge impact. I mean, the market capitalization of some of these companies has come down quite severely. But there's not been real redistribution of wealth. There's some fiddling around the margins in terms of playing less video games, maybe. But I don't see major changes really coming out of any of this, except a slight restriction on the operations of some of the largest companies.
But let me challenge you a bit on that, because if you say that you see weakness under that surface, and yet, I mean, if everything goes to script, essentially politically, Xi Jinping will be at his strongest, at least on paper, once we have the Party Congress and he gets his third term, because it would seem to me, at least just looking at it as a complete outsider, that if anything, his position is much stronger, and that he can afford to focus on some of these cultural issues because he can.
Well, that's a very good point and a good oppositional point to bring up. I have a controversial view on this, which is essentially as a party officer, as the head of the party, his position is preeminent and certainly stronger than maybe Hu Jintao or Wen Jiabao or some of his predecessors. However, economically, I think he's actually at a fairly weak position. Right now, the local governments are starved of money. They don't have enough tax revenue. The debt bubble has backed China into a corner, as I mentioned, because they've now at like 350%, 360% of GDP, debt to GDP, which is way higher than most other countries. And the tech crackdown is not going to, first of all, it's not going to help the economy very much. And there's not much else he's doing. He's trying to invest in what he calls hard tech. He kind of believes that hard tech is more important than soft tech. So in other words, semiconductors over food delivery. Intel over Uber Eats, that kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is they've not had much success with investment in hard tech. Most of the state money to the tune of $100 billion or so is going to take years to generate any returns. And meanwhile, a lot of it's been squandered or even stolen in some cases. So economically, unless he makes fundamental changes, which would essentially mean China would have to move away from the state-controlled communist organization, he doesn't have a lot of tools he can use. And there's been many examples where he's tried to get local governments to increase investment in GDP, and most of the expenditure is at the local government level, provincial and sub-provincial. But he can't really. He doesn't have the money to give them at this point. So they've got to raise their own money. So he can't really direct that much. So it's a very weird situation where in some ways it's like the centralization of the party is increased its control, while the decentralization of the economy is also weakening the central state's control.
Interesting. So, all these parallels with what's happening in the United States, because, all the time when I was reading parts of your book, I kept on hearing Donald Trump's voice in my head saying, "I alone can fix it," and then you mentioned the China's trying to focus on developing its indigenous semiconductor industry, given the whole decoupling atmosphere that's going on, and of course, Taiwan being really the main source for particularly advanced semiconductors in the world. China yet unable to reach that particular level. But it reminded me, of course, of the new CHIPS Act in the United States, which is really meant to in some ways address the same issue for the United States, right?
Yes, it's a very good point. I mean, there's a lot of criticism among some people in finance in the United States against the CHIP Act as being basically not going to be terribly effective. But the CHIP Act is a lot smaller than what Xi Jinping has been doing over the last couple of years in terms of total investment. Okay. And also, he's trying to jumpstart it from not zero, but most of their chip production is quite low end. So he's really trying to go from 0 to 60, while the United States, we're much more advanced on that. But they're very concerned about the decoupling and their reliance on the West. And they have something called dual circulation, which is essentially to try to keep engaging with the Western trade, but build up their domestic economy, and also shift to consumption over investment, because most of their GDP is coming from investing in factories and so forth. The problem with that, as you're indicating, is that they can't get access to some of the high tech equipment to do advanced chip production, mainly these machines that etch chips, ultraviolet light machines, because the technology is owned by the Dutch and the United States. And they don't have the talent either, a lot of which is in Taiwan and in the United States, and they can't get people over. And in terms of the second thing, which is quite important, I mean, their GDP is about 30% consumption or less. In the United States, it's 70%. So consumption is a huge driver. They can't get people to consume more unless they start taking money away from the state system. They're not willing to do that. So these are hoped for goals that are, as I argue in the book, are not likely to achieve much in terms of his attempts to either distribute income better, improve the economy, or decouple its technology from the West.
Now, since we've already talked about it, Taiwan, let me just raise this issue, because I have to say that there were two issues that I thought I was a little surprised that you didn't deal with that much in your book. One was Taiwan. I mean, you do in the semiconductors issue, but the other one was the pandemic. Surprisingly, I mean, you do talk a little bit about it, but I mean, it doesn't really hover there. And I just was imagining you, during our pandemic work from home over these past 2+ years, sitting in your lovely flat with your wonderful wife and writing this book, but yet the pandemic and the factors that are all mixed in there, you didn't really mix it in that much. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that. First of all, what are your views on the impact of the pandemic on the Chinese economy right now, particularly, and on these particular issues we've been talking about? And then secondly, on the Taiwan issue, which now, of course, has been at the forefront in recent weeks because of the visit of Nancy Pelosi. to Taipei.
Well, yeah, once again, very good points. And I should have had you as my editor because I probably should have included something more about the pandemic. But I mean, the part of it was that, I sort of felt like the pandemic was going to be short-lived. And I was wrong on that. I mean, it's been quite long-lived and it's had a pretty severe impact on China in many ways. I mean, first of all, there's some companies have managed to keep their factories running by having closed loop production where you can't leave. And so that's been somewhat advantageous. And the exports have done very well for reasons that people are having difficulty explaining, because you have to obviously keep your ports open and move people out. But I think they've had huge testing facilities for COVID at the ports and able to manage that. The economy has definitely been hurt. And a lot of the small business that relies on, people serving food or haircuts or whatever has been, they can't go out and do it. So a lot of people have been forced to be unemployed. And we're not seeing that so much because the press can't report it. But that has been very harmful to a lot of people's livelihoods within China. The third issue is the fact that there's a lot of anger by domestic Chinese against these policies. We obviously saw in Shanghai, there was a lockdown and huge hue and cry about that. But other parts of the country that aren't so visible to us because they're less international have also had similar problems, where all of a sudden you could be locked down. And as you know, there's videos of people fleeing shopping malls because there's rumors that there was a case and everybody will be locked into the shopping mall for days on end.
I mean, we recently got reports out of Hainan, people that we know, right?
People went for a holiday to this holiday resort, like the Florida of China, and all of a sudden, they're stuck for 3 weeks. They can't get back to Beijing.
Right.
So that's created a lot of hostility towards the government and a lot of worries about the uncertainty about how government policy is going to operate, the zero COVID policy. So a lot of the wealthier people are now actually leaving. I think they've lost a lot of talent. They've lost a lot of foreign talent, definitely. And I think some of the domestic wealthier people have left. So a lot. This is not a policy that was done very well, because they should have vaccinated more quickly, and they didn't. And they relied on their own domestic vaccines, which were ineffectual. On the Taiwan question,
maybe not as effective as the mRNA ones, but I mean they have some they have a
50% versus
reasonable
80%.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so it's fairly low, but they turned down an agreement with foreign providers, which they shouldn't have done. Out of pure nationalism, basically. On the Taiwan issue, I've always steered clear of that because I'm not a military analyst, but I recently did write research for my clients, a 10-page report on Taiwan. And I concluded that there's only two circumstances that would cause them to invade within the next 5 years or so. One is, if the US became much more aggressive in terms of explicit support for Taiwan. But that would have to be quite significant in terms of warships and so forth. And the second one is the issue of a blockade, a sort of a soft blockade that sort of got worse and worse. And at some point, the thinking was the Taiwanese would essentially agree to this and say, look, well, we need to get rid of the blockade, so we have to start playing ball with the mainland. However, it's pretty clear that the capacity for an invasion is quite limited. There's a huge supply chain problem for China, and getting across the strait with enough Straits of Taiwan with enough men would be difficult. There's a lot of military analysts who say that there's a lot of weakness within the military. Right. And the Ukraine situation, as I think everybody has said, is indicated that there's a lot more potential for domestic opposition in Taiwan than people thought. And then the other part is related to the book, is you can't make semiconductors. The U.S. and the big producer of design equipment in the Netherlands would immediately withdraw their support, and that would mean that China would not be able to get high-end chips for their phones or any other high-tech equipment. So I think that there's it's unlikely to get to war anytime soon.
That's good news.
So, I hope. I live in Hong Kong.
Right, no, exactly. So, seeing you brought it up, Hong Kong. So let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the things when this audit oversight agreement came up is, at least I've been thinking, and I know a number of folks that I've been talking about this with, we've been wondering, well, is it a benefit for Hong Kong? Is it going to avert that expected Russia listings that we're going to get? as a result of delistings in New York? What's the net impact? And then more broadly, you are somewhat skeptical in your book about Hong Kong's ability to maintain its status certainly at the level it had done in the past as an international financial center. In fact, you're kind of harsh, I have to say, and let me just say that outright, because I'm going to read here because I was so taken by this particular section. Longer term, China's use of Hong Kong as a kind of airlock between China and the West is likely to suffer. The integration of Hong Kong's financial, legal, and political system with the mainland over time will erode the very values that make Hong Kong valuable to China. Party interference in financial transactions, political control of the legal system, and other Chinese ways of operating will replace existing Hong Kong norms. Western talent, along with the Western legal structure, will depart, leaving Hong Kong as, oh dear, another Chinese city. Oh, that's the most damning phrase that I ever hear all the time. Just more expensive, right? Hong Kong is not the solution to China's globalization ambition. So tell us about why you have these kind of dire views of Hong Kong. And maybe, there are many reasons to be pessimistic at this point.
Well, I should preface this by saying I've worked for a number of Chinese institutions. Probably half a dozen, including some major banks, not just the Bank of China, but also the second largest brokerage in China. So I have some sense of how they work. The issue is that the United States is way too pessimistic about the future of China, as you and I both know. Every time you go back to New York and DC, they just say, well, Hong Kong is over, and that is not true. Where our conversation here is quite free and open, It is true that, and the PCAOB meeting is a good sign, and I'm sure that Hong Kong is desperate to keep that movement alive in order to get those companies listed in Hong Kong. However, as I say in the book, that you cannot have, the reason why people are here is really because, first of all, there's a way for China to control capital flows that's sort of a neutral territory, because they don't have an open capital account, but China is a great way to, as I said, an airlock, basically. Which they can continue to maintain. But however, the second thing is you can write contracts in Hong Kong knowing that the contract is safe and you're safe. Unfortunately, with some of the few legal cases that we've had that are more political in nature than financial, that sanctity of the personal, the Western people and people against the state has been trembled. And I talked to an Israeli lawyer recently who said to me, sure, her tech clients in Israel won't write contracts in Hong Kong anymore because they don't believe in 5 or 10 years that those contracts necessarily will be stable enough. So at least one country is already shifting away from here as a center for that. And if you know China, you know that the party influence is becoming stronger. They're explicit about that. And they're now saying that HSBC and some banks that are sort of semi-Western have to have party involvement. So what happens if you're in a meeting and you've got a contract that you're doing and all of a sudden the party person says, well, look, I don't want to publicize this, but I think we need to shift the terms of the agreement. And so you can't talk about it publicly. You have to do what they say because they're the ultimate authority. And so, and they may say something like, furthermore, if you don't live up to this, we may have to, under the national security law in Hong Kong, we can actually move you to China to be tried in the Chinese courts. And a lot of businessmen who are from Europe and the United States in particular are not comfortable with that because obviously their future, something could happen. And you could even have a minor business dispute, as has happened in China, that suddenly gets politicized. And so two people argue and they'll say, well, look, we've got the national security law, let's grab this person. We're not there yet. We're far from being there. So I think this is a long-term process, but I think it's inevitable.
Now why do you think it's inevitable? Because especially also, what is the actual tolerance of businesses? I don't mean to be churlish about, people's freedoms and the, freedom of expression, because I think everybody should be concerned about those encroachments, right? But, and again, I'm going to bring up maybe a bit of a straw man here because, Singapore, right? So you might have folks in the financial sector say, I'm off to Singapore, right? But Singapore is, with all due apologies, with all due respect to my friends in Singapore, their judiciary has always had a kind of political tinge to it, and you have any cases that may have political dimensions, that it then becomes less than predictable, right? I mean, I think this is more limited now than it used to be, but and certainly, where else in Asia would you go if you wanted the kind of quality of the rule of law, at least in the apolitical, the non-political sphere, than here?
Well, that's a very good point, but I'm not so convinced that Singapore is going to replace Hong Kong, because first of all, Singapore is limiting foreigners' entry.
Right.
And second of all, as you pointed out, the rule of law has its own issues in terms of government interference. That's a problem for businesses, but I think a lot of businesses essentially are going to say, okay, look, if we're going to do business in China and Hong Kong is really not that much better than Shanghai, let's just move to Shanghai. Or Beijing. We'll be closer to the center of power. We've got operations there anyway. Let's just do that. And then we'll have other contracts and we'll have to write it in another jurisdiction, whether that's Taipei, Seoul, New York, or London.
Or do arbitration that's based elsewhere, right? Or something like
right.
that.
Yeah. Right. So yes, that's exactly it. So, and as I said, this is not a rapid change. And so that means that a lot of people may say, well, if things don't get worse. But the problem I have is that you've got a huge mainland operation now here under the liaison office, which is the representative of the Chinese government in Hong Kong. And that office has, by some estimates, there's no official numbers, more than 1,000 people. And every year they've got to come up with things that they're doing to show that they're effective. And that means inserting their control into the system. And that's sort of inevitable. If you're Communist Party, you're basically, that's your job. And Xi Jinping is certainly going to be reinforcing that. So I think that the creeping control is going to continue.
Andy, you've been very generous with your time, but I'm going to tax it even more. I'm going to tax you even more. So your last chapter, and I don't want to be a spoiler. So spoiler alert for anyone who doesn't want to know the fascinating ending of Andy's book. But you call it Xi Jinping's Endgame, and I was fascinated by it because even though you call it that, you do raise the issues that maybe he doesn't have an end game. In other words, he doesn't really have a kind of ultimate goal or whatever. It's I mean, and as we know, a lot of things in China can also be a bit of as Ang in University of Michigan calls it like directed improvisation. There's a lot of improvisation that can be going on. But what is your sense of Xi Jinping's endgame with all that we've discussed, particularly with regard to the tech sector? And all the new regulation, the issues relating to data security and all of that?
Well, I think he wants to keep the integrity of the Chinese state intact. I think that the dissolution of the Soviet Union has really, really impressed the leadership and Xi himself. The other thing that I think has been influential is the mortgage crisis in 2008 in the United States. And given that China has a debt bubble, I think that's really been influential, because everybody's sitting here thinking, well, the United States is supposed to have this great financial system, and look what they did and how many people got hurt by that. So those are two things that are very important to him. And so he's trying to, and the third thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of the culture. He does believe that the Communist Party is good for the average Chinese citizen, and he wants to create sort of the communist system that they maybe the iron rice bowl that they had in the 50s and the 60s, when the state took care of everybody and there was a sense of harmony, or at least in his mind there was. I'm not sure everybody would agree with that. So it's kind of an outdated view in my sense, but that's, I think, what he is aiming for. But as you just indicated, I mean, too often observers in the West say, well, gee, China's got this, as Kissinger said, they use the game of Go. It's very strategic, long-term thinking. I don't buy that. I've been in China enough to think that every year they're just trying to come up with their targets and try to beat them, all these local party officials in the provinces, and their long-term is to get promoted in 3 years. I mean, that's about it. So I don't think, Taiwan may be kind of a long-term goal, yes, but there's the avenue to get there is still under discussion. So I don't think that he's necessarily got some long-term strategic plan apart from these goals. And common prosperity and the tech crackdown were ways for him to try to say, okay, these are in order to keep my goals intact, I have to get rid of these big companies with too much power, and I have to try to move China away from this global capitalism that China was engaging in with these huge companies that were running around the world raising money. We have to move back to what I view as the center of the Chinese system. So that's the short-term actions for long-term goals.
Right.
But the pathway there beyond what he's done, I don't think they really know, because frankly, they have no easy solutions to reviving the economy apart from wholesale change in the system.
This is a topic for your fourth book, Andy. I think the issues like what kind of no easy solutions. Maybe that's the title. Because there are certainly as I say, I think your superpower as an author, I think, is really that you connect all these dots, and I think it's really important to see that kind of perspective, to understand what's going on in China, not to point out the warts and everything, but to really just understand the challenges that they have, and also, in some ways, the sources of the friction that does exist between China and the United States and its allies, partners in the West and others, right? There's a lot of that interweaving of the domestic and the global and the regional and all that sort of thing. So, Andy, this has been fantastic. You've been more than generous with your time, so it's been illuminating. I really recommend to our readers and listeners, our Asia Global Institute constituencies, to please look at Andy's book. It's called China's Technology War: Why Beijing Took Down Its Tech Giants, and it's published very recently by Palgrave Macmillan, and it's available on Amazon, as I'm sure it is, because I saw it there. But so Andy, again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Al. I really appreciate your time.